The rain hammered against the tall windows of Ashford Palace as Crown Prince Alexander stood in his father's study, his jaw clenched in frustration. King Edward sat behind his massive oak desk, looking older than his 62 years, while Queen Consort Helena perched elegantly on the leather sofa, her emerald dress perfectly pressed despite the late hour. "You cannot be serious about this, father," Alexander said, his voice barely controlled. "The Northern Territories have been my responsibility for 3 years. The people there trust me. They know me." Helena's lips curved into what might have been a smile, but her eyes remained cold. "Perhaps that's precisely the problem, Alexander. Your informal approach has created too much familiarity. The monarchy requires distance, respect, authority. What it requires," Alexander shot back, "is genuine connection with the people we serve. Something you might understand if you'd spent more than a few hours in public appearances." "Alexander," King Edward's voice cracked like a whip, "you will show Helena the respect due to your queen." Alexander laughed bitterly. "My queen? She's been married to you for barely 2 years, father. She doesn't understand this kingdom, its people, or what they need." Helena rose gracefully from the sofa, smoothing her skirt. "I understand perfectly well that the Northern Territories are experiencing unrest because of your permissive policies. The mining unions are becoming too bold, the farmers are demanding subsidies we cannot afford, and your environmental initiatives are crippling our industrial partnerships. Those partnerships are with companies that poison our rivers and exploit our workers," Alexander countered. "If that's the price of your idea of stability, then perhaps we need a different kind of stability." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. King Edward rubbed his temples, looking between his son and his wife. Alexander could see the exhaustion in his father's face, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of recent pressures. The king's health had been declining since his heart attack the previous year, and everyone knew it, though no one spoke of it openly. "The decision has been made," King Edward said finally. "Helena will take over the Northern Territories portfolio. You'll focus on international trade relations." Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. International trade relations was essentially a ceremonial role, shuffling between embassy dinners and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. It was where they put royals who were being quietly sidelined. "Father, please reconsider. The mining legislation alone requires someone who understands that we cannot afford to alienate the Cromwell Mining Consortium," Helena interrupted smoothly. "They employ 30,000 people across the kingdom. Your environmental crusade threatens their operations. Their operations threaten the health of entire communities." Alexander's voice rose. "Have you seen the reports from Millbrook? Children with respiratory problems, contaminated water supplies, isolated incidents." Helena waved dismissively. "The economic benefits far outweigh the minor environmental concerns." Alexander stared at her in disbelief. "Minor environmental concerns? Helena, these are people's lives we're discussing. These are economic realities," she replied coolly. "Something you seem unwilling to grasp. Perhaps it's time you learned that being a prince is about more than playing the people's champion." The words stung because Alexander knew there was a grain of truth in them. He had always been more comfortable among farmers and factory workers than in palace drawing rooms. He genuinely cared about the struggles of ordinary citizens, and that care had shaped his approach to royal duties. But Helena made it sound like a weakness of failing. "I won't stand by and watch you undo 3 years of progress," Alexander said quietly. Helena's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "You won't have a choice in the matter. The transfer of responsibilities will be announced tomorrow morning. I suggest you spend your time preparing for your new role rather than fighting a battle you've already lost." King Edward sighed heavily. "Alexander, I know this is difficult, but Helena has extensive experience in corporate relations. She understands the delicate balance between environmental concerns and economic necessity." Alexander looked at his father with a mixture of love and disappointment. "Since when did we start putting corporate profits above our people's welfare? Since we realized that without corporate profits, we'd have no kingdom left to govern," Helena said sharply. Your idealism is admirable, Alexander, but it's not practical. The Northern Territories need strong leadership, not a bleeding heart. What they need is someone who actually gives a damn about them. Alexander shot back. The door opened, and Sir Marcus Whitfield, the king's private secretary, entered with obvious reluctance. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but the Prime Minister is on the telephone. He says it's urgent regarding the trade summit. King Edward nodded wearily. I'll take in the blue study. Alexander, Helena, we'll continue this discussion in the morning. As the king left, followed by Sir Marcus, Alexander found himself alone with Helena for the first time in months. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken hostilities. You really despise me, don't you? Helena said finally, her voice softer but no less cold. Alexander considered the question seriously. I despise what you represent. The old way of thinking. The idea that the monarchy exists to serve itself rather than the people. And I suppose you think your father married me for political convenience? Didn't he? Alexander asked bluntly. Helena's composure cracked slightly. Your father married me because he was lonely, because your mother's death left him broken, and he needed someone who could help him carry the burden of the crown. But you've never forgiven me for not being her. Alexander felt a stab of guilt. His mother, Queen Catherine, had been beloved by the people and had shared his passion for social justice. Her death in a car accident 5 years earlier had devastated both Alexander and his father. This isn't about my mother, he said, though they both knew it partly was. Isn't it? You see me as an intruder, someone who's stolen your father's affection and now threatens your position as heir. But I'm not your enemy, Alexander. I want what's best for this kingdom, just not what's best for its people. Helena's eyes flashed. The people will thank me when their jobs are secure and the economy is stable. Your environmental policies sound noble, but they're economically disastrous. Do you know how close we are to losing the Cromwell contract entirely? Alexander frowned. What are you talking about? The mining consortium is considering moving their operations to Valdonia. They claim our environmental regulations have become too restrictive, too expensive to comply with. If they leave, we lose not just 30,000 jobs, but billions in tax revenue. This was news to Alexander. When did this happen? The preliminary discussions began 3 weeks ago. Your father and I've been working frantically to salvage the situation. That's why this transfer of responsibilities is so critical. I can negotiate with Cromwell's board. I understand their concerns. Alexander felt a chill. If the Cromwell Mining Consortium really was considering leaving the kingdom, the economic impact would be catastrophic. The Northern Territories depended heavily on mining jobs, and the ripple effects would be felt throughout the entire kingdom. Why wasn't I informed about these discussions? He asked. Helena's smile was thin. Because your reaction would have been predictable. You'd have suggested we let them leave and find more environmentally friendly alternatives. But there are no alternatives, Alexander. Not in the short term. Not without massive unemployment and economic collapse. The weight of this revelation settled on Alexander's shoulders like a lead blanket. If Helena was telling the truth, then his environmental initiatives really might be threatening the kingdom's economic stability. But something about her explanation didn't sit right with him. Helena always seemed to have convenient facts that supported her position. I want to see the correspondence with Cromwell, he said. That's not your concern anymore. As of tomorrow, it's mine. It's my concern as future king. Helena stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked gardens. The future is a long way off, Alexander. Your father is in excellent health, and there's no guarantee you'll inherit his perspective on governance by the time your turn comes. There was something ominous in her tone that made Alexander's skin crawl. What's that supposed to mean? It means that perhaps your time in international trade relations will give you a broader perspective on the realities of modern monarchy. The world is changing, Alexander. Kingdoms that fail to adapt don't survive. Is that a threat? Helena turned from the window, her expression unreadable. It's an observation. Your great-grandfather lost half his kingdom because he refused to modernize. Your grandfather nearly lost the rest because he couldn't balance tradition with progress. Your father has managed to stabilize things, but barely. The monarchy's survival depends on making hard choices, not popular ones. Alexander studied her face, looking for some sign of the woman his father had fallen in love with. But all he saw was cold calculation. What did you tell Cromwell about me? I told him the truth, that environmental policy would be handled by someone who understands business realities. You undermined me. I saved your father's kingdom. The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Alexander realized that this conversation wasn't really about policy differences or family dynamics. It was about power, and Helena was showing him exactly how much she had accumulated. We'll see about that, he said quietly. Helena's smile was sharp as a blade. Yes, we will. As Alexander left the study, his mind raced with questions and suspicions. Helena's story about Cromwell moving to Valdonia was convenient, but was it true? And if it was true, how much of it was a direct result of her influence rather than his policies? He decided he needed answers, and he knew where to start looking. Sir Marcus Whitfield had been his father's private secretary for 15 years. If anyone knew the full truth about the Cromwell situation, it would be Marcus. Alexander found Marcus in his small office adjacent to the king's private study, reviewing correspondence by lamplight despite the late hour. Sir Marcus, might I have a word? The older man looked up, his weathered face showing concern. Of course, Your Highness. How may I help you? I need to know about the Cromwell Mining Consortium. Helena mentioned they're considering relocating to Valdonia. Marcus's expression became carefully neutral. I'm afraid such matters fall under the Queen Consort's purview now, Your Highness. Marcus, please. I'm not asking for state secrets. I just need to understand if my environmental policies are really threatening the kingdom's economy. The private secretary was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing loyalties. Finally, he sighed. Your Highness, I've served your family for 15 years. I watched you grow up, watched you develop your passion for serving the people. What I'm about to say is spoken in confidence. Alexander nodded eagerly. The Cromwell situation is complex. Yes, they've expressed concerns about environmental regulations. But the primary issue isn't your policies themselves. It's the proposed amendments that Her Majesty has suggested. Alexander frowned. What amendments? Amendments that would actually weaken existing environmental protections while appearing to strengthen them. The consortium isn't threatening to leave because your policies are too strict. They're threatening to leave because they want even more concessions, and they're using Her Majesty's amendments as leverage. The room seemed to spin slightly around Alexander. Are you saying Helena is negotiating against the kingdom's environmental interests? I'm saying the situation is more complicated than it appears. The consortium wants mining rights in the protected watersheds of the Northern Territories. Your environmental policies currently prohibit that. Her Majesty's proposed amendments would create loopholes that would effectively allow such mining. Alexander felt sick. And my father knows about this? Marcus hesitated. His Majesty has been unwell since his heart attack. He relies heavily on Her Majesty's guidance on economic matters. She presents the information in a way that emphasizes the economic benefits while minimizing the environmental costs. Marcus, I need to see those proposed amendments. The private secretary shook his head reluctantly. I'm sorry, Your Highness, but those documents are restricted. Only His Majesty and Her Majesty have access. Then, I need to get access. Marcus looked troubled. Your Highness, I must advise caution. Her Majesty has considerable influence with His Majesty currently. Any direct challenge to her authority could have serious consequences for your position. Alexander understood the warning, but he couldn't simply stand by while Helena potentially sold out the kingdom's environmental future for short-term economic gain. Marcus, what would you do in my position? The older man was quiet for several moments. I will be very careful, Your Highness, and I would make sure I had absolute proof before making any accusations. As Alexander walked back to his chambers, Marcus's words echoed in his mind. Absolute proof. But how could he get proof when all the relevant documents were restricted? The answer came to him as he passed the garage wing of the palace. Helena's private car would be parked there, and she was known to keep a leather briefcase in the vehicle for confidential documents when traveling between meetings. If the Cromwell correspondence and proposed amendments existed, there was a chance they might be in that briefcase. Alexander knew it was a risk. If he was caught searching Helena's car, it would give her the perfect excuse to have him removed from the succession entirely. But if she was really planning to sacrifice the Northern Territories' environment for corporate profits, he had to stop her. The palace garages were dimly lit and empty at this late hour. Helena's sleek black sedan sat in its designated spot, looking innocuous enough. Alexander approached it carefully, checking to make sure he was truly alone. The car was unlocked, which surprised him until he remembered that palace security made theft unlikely. He slipped into the back seat and began searching for the briefcase Marcus had mentioned. It took several minutes, but he finally found it tucked under the driver's seat. The briefcase was locked, but Alexander had learned a few unconventional skills during his university years that his royal tutors hadn't taught him. The lock was simple, and within moments he had it open. Inside were several folders of documents, exactly as he'd hoped. But as he began reading by the dim overhead light, his heart sank. The documents were far worse than he'd imagined. The proposed amendments weren't just about mining rights. Helena was negotiating a complete restructuring of the kingdom's environmental protections. The Cromwell Mining Consortium would receive exclusive rights to mineral extraction across vast areas of the Northern Territories, including several nature preserves and the watershed that supplied fresh water to 6 major towns. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. At the bottom of the briefcase, Alexander found a folder labeled Succession Contingencies. His hands trembled as he opened it and began reading. The documents inside outlined a detailed plan for undermining his position as heir to the throne. Helena had been documenting every decision he'd made as administrator of the Northern Territories, painting them in the worst possible light. Environmental protections became economically reckless policies. His popular town halls with citizens became dangerous populist tendencies. His support for workers' rights became socialist sympathies inappropriate for a future monarch. But the most damning document was a psychological evaluation, supposedly conducted by the kingdom's chief psychiatrist, Dr. Pemberton. According to the report, Alexander showed signs of unstable judgment, poor risk assessment, and tendencies toward radical ideology that make him unfit for future kingship. Alexander stared at the document in disbelief. He'd never undergone any psychological evaluation by Dr. Pemberton or anyone else. The entire report was fabricated. At the bottom of the evaluation was a recommendation that Alexander be removed from the line of succession in favor of his younger sister, Princess Isabel, who was currently studying abroad and had little interest in royal duties. The recommendation noted that Isabel would be more amenable to guidance and less likely to pursue destabilizing policies. Alexander's mind reeled. Helena wasn't just trying to take over his responsibilities in the Northern Territories. She was orchestrating his complete removal from the succession. And if she succeeded, she would effectively control the kingdom through Isabel, who had neither the experience nor the inclination to resist Helena's influence. As he photographed the documents with his phone, Alexander heard footsteps approaching the garage. His heart hammered as he quickly returned the papers to the briefcase and snapped it shut. He managed to return it to its hiding spot and slip out of the car just as the garage door opened. Palace security guard Thomas Jenkins entered, making his routine rounds. "Your Highness, I didn't expect to see you here at this hour." Alexander's mind raced for an explanation. "I left something in my car earlier," he said, gesturing vaguely toward his own vehicle parked nearby. Thomas nodded respectfully. "Of course, sir. Have a good evening." As Alexander walked back toward the palace, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Helena. "I trust our conversation tonight was enlightening. Sleep well, Alexander. Tomorrow brings many changes." The message made his blood run cold. Did she suspect what he discovered, or was she simply gloating over her victory in reassigning his duties? Alexander reached his chambers and immediately began reviewing the photographs he'd taken. The evidence was damning, but it also raised new questions. How long had Helena been planning this? Did his father know about the fabricated psychological evaluation? And, most importantly, what other documents might exist that he hadn't found? As he studied the papers, one detail caught his attention. Several of the documents were co-signed by someone identified only as Executive Partner VM. The signature was illegible, but the initials suggested this conspiracy extended beyond Helena herself. Alexander realized he was no longer dealing with a simple family dispute or policy disagreement. He had stumbled onto something much larger and more dangerous. Helena had allies, resources, and a detailed plan to reshape the kingdom's government. And she was apparently willing to destroy his reputation and remove him from succession to achieve her goals. The question now was what to do with this information. Going directly to his father was risky if the king was as dependent on Helena's counsel as Marcus had suggested. But Alexander couldn't simply sit on evidence of such massive deception. As dawn broke over Ashford Palace, Alexander made a decision. He would need allies of his own, and he knew exactly where to start. The Northern Territories had trusted him for 3 years, and the people there deserved to know what Helena was planning for their land, their water, and their future. But first, he needed to secure the original documents. The photographs on his phone were useful evidence, but they could be dismissed as fabrications if Helena chose to deny their authenticity. He needed the real papers, and getting them would require a much more dangerous gamble than sneaking into her car. Alexander looked out at the brightening sky and steeled himself for the fight ahead. Helena had made the first move in what was clearly a carefully planned campaign. Now, it was his turn to respond. The future of the kingdom, and his own survival as heir to the throne, depended on how well he played the next hand in this deadly game of royal politics. The next morning arrived with the precision of a well-oiled machine, bringing with it the formal announcement of Alexander's reassignment. The palace press office released a carefully worded statement about expanding the crown prince's expertise in international commerce, while Queen Consort Helena would bring her considerable business experience to bear on the vital Northern Territories portfolio. Alexander read the announcement in his private study while his morning coffee grew cold. The wording was Helena's, he was certain of that. Every phrase was calculated to make his demotion sound like a promotion while positioning her as the capable leader the territories needed. His phone buzzed with the first of what would surely be dozens of calls from journalists, politicians, and concerned citizens. Alexander ignored them all. Instead, he called his personal aide, James Morrison, a man who had served the royal family with quiet discretion for 8 years. James, I need you to arrange a private meeting with Lord Chancellor Harrison. Not here at the palace. Somewhere discreet. Of course, Your Highness. Might I ask the nature of the meeting? Alexander hesitated. James was loyal, but even loyal servants could unknowingly pass information to the wrong ears. Constitutional matters. And, James, not a word to anyone about this meeting. Not even my father's office. Understood, sir. Lord Chancellor Harrison was one of the few remaining officials who had served under Alexander's grandfather. At 73, he was a walking repository of constitutional law and royal protocol. If anyone could advise Alexander on the legal implications of what he'd discovered, it would be Harrison. While waiting for James to arrange the meeting, Alexander decided to make a call that might prove even more important. He dialed a number he hadn't used in over a year. Millbrook Mining Union Office, Sarah speaking. Sarah, this is Alexander. Is Michael available? There was a pause. Sarah Pemberton had known Alexander since he was a teenager visiting the Northern Territories with his mother. Your Highness, Michael's in a meeting with the Safety Committee, but I know he'll want to speak with you. Just a moment. Within seconds, Michael Reeves was on the line. As head of the Millbrook Mining Union, Michael had been one of Alexander's strongest allies in pushing for environmental protections and worker safety improvements. Alex, thank God you called. We heard about the announcement this morning. What the hell is happening up there? Alexander appreciated Michael's directness. The man had never treated him with the formal deference most people showed royalty. Michael, I need to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Has anyone from the palace contacted the Union about changing the environmental protection agreements? Funny you should ask. We got a call yesterday from someone claiming to represent the Queen Consort. Said there might be some adjustments to the mining regulations to help secure jobs. We told them to go through proper channels. Alexander's heart sank. Helena was moving even faster than he'd anticipated. Michael, whatever they're proposing, don't agree to anything until you've seen the full documentation. And I mean everything. Alex, you're scaring me. What's really going on? Alexander weighed his options. Michael Reeves was trustworthy, but involving him in royal politics could put the Union leader in an impossible position. I can't give you details yet, but I promise you'll know everything soon. Just be very careful about any offers that seem too good to be true. They always are, Michael replied grimly. Listen, Alex, whatever's happening, the people here trust you. We know you've got our backs. Don't let the palace politics crowd make you forget that. The call ended just as James returned with news that Lord Chancellor Harrison could meet at his private club at 2 o'clock. The timing would be perfect, as Helena would be conducting her first official meeting with Northern Territories officials at that same hour. Alexander spent the morning reviewing every document related to the Cromwell Mining Consortium that he could access through his official channels. What he found troubled him even more than the previous night's discoveries. Cromwell's environmental violations had been steadily increasing over the past 18 months, but enforcement had been mysteriously lax. Fines that should have been the millions were reduced to thousands. Inspection schedules that were supposed to be random had become predictably routine, giving the company time to prepare for visits. Most disturbing of all, 3 separate environmental impact studies commissioned by the kingdom's Department of Natural Resources had been classified as pending review for over a year. Alexander suspected those studies contained evidence that would make Cromwell's operations untenable under current law. At noon, he received an unexpected visitor. Princess Isabel, his younger sister, stood in his doorway, looking uncharacteristically serious. At 24, Isabel was typically more interested in art galleries and charity galas than palace politics. Her sudden appearance suggested that word of the morning's announcement had reached her in London, where she was supposedly focused on her master's degree in art history. Izzy, what are you doing here? I thought you were in classes. Isabel closed the door behind her and fixed him with a look that reminded Alexander of their late mother. Alex, we need to talk. About Helena, about what's really happening here, about what Father isn't seeing. Alexander studied his sister carefully. Isabel had always been perceptive, but she'd also been remarkably good at staying out of palace politics. What do you mean? I mean that I'm not as oblivious as everyone thinks. I've been watching Helena since she married Father. She's been building a network, Alex, creating dependencies, gathering information, positioning herself as indispensable. You've noticed this from London? Isabel sat down across from him, her expression grim. I've been watching from London, yes, but also from Paris, Rome, Vienna, and a dozen other places where I've encountered people who seem remarkably well-informed about our family's private business. People who shouldn't know those things unless someone with access was feeding them information. Alexander felt a chill. What kind of information? Everything. Father's health problems that aren't supposed to be public knowledge. Your environmental initiatives before they were announced. Even personal details about our mother's charity foundation that only family members should know. Izzy, who were these people? Journalists, mostly, but also business executives, diplomats, even academics. All asking very pointed questions about the stability of our monarchy, the likelihood of policy changes, the prospects for different successors. Isabel post mininofelli. Several of them asked specifically about my own political views and whether I'd be interested in taking a more active role in royal duties. The implication hit Alexander like a physical blow. Helena wasn't just planning his removal from succession. She was actively preparing Isabel to replace him. And based on these conversations, she'd been laying groundwork across Europe for months. Izzy, what did you tell these people? What I always tell people when they ask about palace business, that I'm focused on my studies and have no official role in government. Isabel's voice became sharper. But, Alex, some of these conversations happened before Helena was even engaged to father. This isn't opportunistic maneuvering. This is long-term planning. Alexander's mind raced. If Isabel was right, then Helena's infiltration of the royal family went back much further than anyone had suspected. Did you tell father about these encounters? I tried, but you know how he gets when I criticize Helena. He thinks I'm just being protective of mother's memory. Isabel's voice softened. Maybe I was at first, but this goes way beyond family dynamics, Alex. This is about the future of our kingdom. What are you suggesting we do? Isabel was quiet for a moment, then reached in her purse and pulled out a small recording device. I'm suggesting we start gathering our own evidence. Because if Helena is planning what I think she's planning, we're going to need proof that even father can't ignore. Alexander stared at the recorder. Izzy, that's incredibly dangerous. If Helena discovered you were recording conversations, then I'd better be very careful not to get caught. Isabel's smile was sharp and determined. Alex, I may have spent the last few years playing the harmless little princess, but I'm not helpless. And I'm certainly not going to stand by while Helena destroys our family and our kingdom. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. James entered with obvious reluctance. Your Highness, Sir Marcus requests your immediate presence in the king's study. He says it's urgent regarding the Northern Territories transition. Alexander exchanged a look with Isabel. We'll continue this conversation later, he said quietly. Count on it, Isabel replied. As Alexander walked through the palace corridors toward his father's study, he wondered if Helena had somehow learned about his midnight investigation. The timing of this summons, coming so soon after Isabel's revelations, seemed ominous. He found his father alone in the study, looking pale and tired. King Edward gestured for Alexander to sit, then spent a long moment simply studying his son's face. Alexander, I've just received a very troubling report from palace security. Alexander's heart hammered, but he kept his expression neutral. What kind of report? It seems that someone accessed Queen Helena's vehicle last night. Nothing was taken, but the security system registered unusual activity in the garage area around midnight. King Edward's voice was carefully controlled. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Alexander realized he was at a crucial crossroads. He could deny everything and probably escape suspicion, but that would mean allowing Helena's plan to proceed unchecked. Or he could tell his father the truth and risk everything on the hope that the evidence would speak for itself. Father, I did go to Helena's car last night. King Edward's face darkened. Alexander, what in God's name were you thinking? I was thinking that someone needed to verify the claims being made about the Northern Territory situation. And what I found concerns me greatly. You searched Helena's private belongings without permission? I found documents that suggest the Cromwell Mining Consortium situation isn't what it appears to be. Father, Helena isn't trying to save jobs. She's negotiating a deal that would devastate the Northern Territories environment in exchange for massive mining concessions. King Edward's expression shifted from anger to something approaching disbelief. That's a very serious accusation, Alexander. I have proof. Proof obtained through an illegal search of my wife's property. Alexander pulled out his phone. Father, look at these documents. The proposed amendments to environmental law, the fabricated psychological evaluation, the correspondence with someone identified as Executive Partner VM. This isn't about policy differences. This is about systematically undermining my position and allowing corporate interests to exploit our natural resources. King Edward took the phone with obvious reluctance. As he scrolled through the photographs, his face grew increasingly pale. Alexander watched his father's expression change from skepticism to confusion to dawning horror. This psychological evaluation, I never authorized this. Because it's fabricated, Dr. Pemberton never examined me. Helena created this document to justify my removal from succession. King Edward set down the phone and rubbed his temples. Alexander, these are very serious allegations. If they're true, then your wife has been systematically deceiving you while planning to fundamentally alter the kingdom's government and natural resource policies. The king was quiet for several long minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than Alexander had ever heard it. Even if these documents are genuine, they were obtained illegally. Helena would be within her rights to demand your prosecution. Father, are you more concerned about the method of discovery or the content of what was discovered? I'm concerned about both. Alexander, you've created an impossible situation. How can I confront Helena with evidence obtained through a criminal act? Before Alexander could respond, the study door opened and Helena entered without knocking. She wore a navy blue suit that somehow managed to look both professional and regal, and her expression was perfectly composed. Edward, forgive the interruption, but I thought you should know that the Cromwell meeting went exceptionally well. They've agreed to maintain their current operations in exchange for some very minor regulatory adjustments. Her gaze shifted to Alexander. I do hope you're not upset about missing such an important negotiation. Alexander realized that Helena's timing wasn't coincidental. She had probably known about the security report before his father did. This appearance was theater, designed to present herself as the competent leader while he played the role of sulking prince. Helena, King Edward said carefully, we need to discuss some documents that have come to light. Helena's expression didn't change, but Alexander caught a flicker of something in her eyes. What documents? Documents that suggest the Cromwell situation is more complex than you've indicated. Documents that also raise questions about Alexander's fitness for succession. Helena's smile was thin. So Alexander has shared his midnight discoveries with you. The admission caught both Alexander and King Edward off guard. Helena had known all along. You knew he searched your car? King Edward asked. Of course I knew. Did you really think palace security wouldn't report such an unusual incident directly to me? Helena moved to the window, her posture relaxed and confident. The question is whether you're prepared to deal with the implications of his actions. Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath him. What implications? Helena turned back to face them, and her expression had transformed from composed to coldly furious. The implications of having an heir who thinks himself above the law, who breaks into private property when he doesn't get his way, who photographs confidential documents without authorization, who demonstrates exactly the kind of unstable judgment that makes him unfit for future kingship. Those documents prove you've been lying about the Cromwell situation, Alexander said. Those documents prove that I've been protecting your father's kingdom from your destructive idealism. Helena shot back. Yes, I've been working to modify environmental regulations that threaten our economic stability. Yes, I've been documenting your poor judgment and radical policies. And yes, I've been exploring constitutional options for ensuring stable leadership in the future. King Edward looked between his wife and son with growing dismay. Helena, is the psychological evaluation genuine? The concerns about Alexander's fitness are genuine. The documentation of those concerns follows proper protocols. That's not what I asked. Helena was quiet for a moment, then lifted her chin defiantly. Dr. Pemberton conducted his evaluation based on extensive observation and consultation with palace staff who've worked closely with Alexander. The format may be irregular, but the conclusions are sound. Alexander stared at her in amazement. Even caught in an outright lie, Helena was spinning the situation to her advantage. Helena, Dr. Pemberton never examined me. Palace staff were never consulted. You fabricated the entire document. I documented a pattern of behavior that threatens the stability of our monarchy. Whether that documentation follows traditional formats is less important than its accuracy. King Edward's voice was barely above a whisper. Helena, did you or did you not fabricate that psychological evaluation? The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, Helena spoke. I created a document that accurately reflects Alexander's unfitness for leadership. The source of that information is less relevant than its truth. The source is incredibly relevant, Alexander said, because it determines whether you're protecting the kingdom or manipulating it for your own purposes. Helena's composure finally cracked completely. My purposes? My purposes are to prevent you from destroying everything your father has built. You want to turn this kingdom into some kind of environmental commune where feelings matter more than economic reality. You think making friends with farmers and miners qualifies you to run a modern nation. You're naive, idealistic, and completely unprepared for the harsh realities of leadership. And you think lying, fabricating documents, and undermining the heir to the throne qualifies you to run anything? I think results matter more than methods. Since I became involved in palace affairs, our economic indicators have improved, our international relationships have strengthened, and our domestic stability has increased. Can you say the same about your environmental crusades? King Edward finally found his voice. Helena, regardless of your motivations, you've deceived me about fundamental matters of state. The psychological evaluation, the true nature of the Cromwell negotiations, the systematic documentation of Alexander's activities. How can I trust your counsel if I can't trust your honesty? Helena's expression softened, and for a moment she looked genuinely hurt. Edward, everything I've done has been to protect you and your legacy. Alexander's policies threatened to destroy relationships it took decades to build. His approach to governance is fundamentally incompatible with modern monarchy. I was trying to save you from having to make an impossible choice between your son and your kingdom by making the choice for him, Alexander said quietly. Helena turned to face him directly, by gathering information that would allow him to make an informed choice. Yes, I documented your failures. Yes, I explored alternatives. But every action I took was in service of preventing a constitutional crisis that would have torn this kingdom apart. Alexander realized that Helena genuinely believed what she was saying. In her mind, she wasn't a conspirator seeking power for its own sake. She was a pragmatist making hard choices that others were too weak or sentimental to make. That made her far more dangerous than simple ambition would have. Helena, King Edward said slowly, who is executive partner VM? For the first time since entering the study, Helena looked genuinely surprised. I'm not sure what you mean. The documents Alexander photographed reference someone called executive partner VM. Multiple documents are co-signed by this person. Helena was quiet for several moments, clearly deciding how much to reveal. VM refers to Vincent Morrison, the senior partner at Morrison & Associates. They're a consulting firm that specializes in constitutional law and international relations. Alexander felt puzzle pieces clicking into place. You hired constitutional lawyers to plan my removal from succession. I hired experts to evaluate options for ensuring governmental stability in the face of problematic leadership. Whose leadership? King Edward asked sharply. Helena realized she had revealed more than intended. Edward, your health concerns make succession planning a necessity. Alexander's demonstrated unfitness makes traditional succession problematic. I was exploring legal alternatives. Without consulting me, I was preparing to consult you once I had complete information. Alexander laughed bitterly. Complete information? You mean once you had fabricated enough evidence to make your case seem reasonable? I mean once I had documented enough evidence to show that your continuation as heir apparent would threaten the monarchy's survival. King Edward stood up slowly, suddenly, looking every one of his 62 years. Helena, I think we all need some time to process what's been discussed here. Alexander, you're still scheduled to begin your international trade responsibilities tomorrow. Helena, we'll need to have a much longer conversation about your consulting arrangements and future role in palace affairs. Helena's face went white. Edward, surely you're not suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating that this conversation has raised serious questions about judgment, honesty, and loyalty that require careful consideration. As Helena left the study, her composure restored but, her eyes blazing with fury, Alexander realized that the real battle was just beginning. Helena had been outmaneuvered, but not defeated, and a wounded Helena was likely to be far more dangerous than a confident one. Father, Alexander said as they stood alone in the suddenly quiet study. "What happens now?" King Edward moved to the window and stared out at the palace gardens where he and Alexander had played chess on summer afternoons when Alexander was a boy. "Now we try to figure out how much damage has been done and whether it can be repaired. And Helena? Helena will need to decide whether she's committed to this family or to her own version of what's best for the kingdom." King Edward's voice was sad but determined, because she can't serve both. As Alexander left the study, he found Isabel waiting in the corridor. Her expression told him she'd heard enough to understand the gravity of the situation. "So what's our next move?" she asked quietly. Alexander looked down the corridor, where Helena had disappeared moments earlier. "We prepare for her next move, because I guarantee you, she's not finished yet." 3 days after the confrontation in the king's study, Alexander stood in the rain outside Lord Chancellor Harrison's private club, waiting for what might be the most important meeting of his life. The events of the past week had moved with frightening speed, and Alexander needed constitutional guidance more than ever. Helena had not been idle since their encounter. She'd immediately called an emergency meeting of the Privy Council, ostensibly to discuss the security breach represented by Alexander's unauthorized search of her vehicle. More troubling, she'd somehow managed to schedule a formal review of the heir apparent's fitness for succession, citing recent concerning incidents as justification. Lord Chancellor Harrison arrived exactly on time, his silver hair dampened by the persistent drizzle. At 73, he moved with the careful dignity of a man who'd spent 5 decades navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics. "Your Highness," Harrison said as they settled into a private dining room overlooking the club's garden, "I must say, your request for this meeting came at a most interesting time. You've heard about the Privy Council session? I've heard about many things. The question is which of them are true and which are carefully crafted interpretations of the truth." Harrison studied Alexander with keen gray eyes. "Tell me what really happened." Alexander had prepared for this moment carefully. He needed Harrison's advice, but he also needed to present the facts in a way that wouldn't immediately prejudice the Lord Chancellor against him. He began with the reassignment of his Northern Territory's responsibilities and walked Harrison through each subsequent revelation. When he finished, Harrison was quiet for several long minutes. "Your Highness, you understand that what you've described, if true, represents not just personal betrayal, but potentially treasonous activity. I understand that. But I also understand that proving it will be extraordinarily difficult given the methods by which I obtained the evidence. Indeed, the Queen Consort's legal team will undoubtedly argue that any evidence obtained through unauthorized search is inadmissible for any formal proceedings. They'll characterize your actions as the desperate measures of someone whose own unfitness has been exposed." Alexander felt his heart sink. "So she wins?" "Not necessarily, but you'll need to be very strategic about how you proceed." Harrison leaned forward. "Your Highness, may I ask you a very direct question?" "Of course. Do you believe your father is aware of the full extent of Queen Helena's activities?" Alexander considered this carefully. "I think my father knows she's been more involved in governance than previous consorts. But I don't think he understands that she's been systematically working to undermine my position while pursuing policies that contradict his stated values. And do you believe he's capable of making difficult decisions regarding his wife if presented with undeniable proof of her deception?" This was the heart of Alexander's dilemma. His father genuinely loved Helena, and the king's health had been fragile since his heart attack. Forcing Edward to choose between his son and his wife might literally kill him. "I believe my father will do what he thinks is best for the kingdom. But I also believe Helena has been very careful to present herself as an asset rather than a threat." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Then we need to change that perception. And we need to do it in a way that doesn't require your father to make an impossible choice." "What do you suggest?" "We need Helena to reveal herself, to overreach in a way that exposes her true intentions without your having to present illegally obtained evidence." Alexander frowned. "How do we accomplish that?" "By giving her exactly what she thinks she wants." Harrison's smile was thin but determined. "Your Highness, What if I told you that the formal review of your fitness for succession could become the very trap that destroys Queen Helena's credibility? Over the next hour, Harrison outlined a strategy that was both brilliant and risky. Rather than fighting the succession review, Alexander would embrace it. He would demand that it be conducted with full transparency, including public hearings where all evidence could be examined by constitutional experts. Most importantly, he would insist that any documentation used in the review be authenticated by independent authorities. Helena's fabricated psychological evaluation won't survive professional scrutiny, Harrison explained. And if she's forced to defend its authenticity in a public forum, she'll either have to admit the fabrication or double down with additional lies that could be more easily disproven. But what if the review finds against me anyway? Then you'll appeal to the people directly. Your popularity in the Northern Territories is genuine, Your Highness. The environmental protections you've championed have real public support. If Helena's corporate-friendly policies are exposed to public scrutiny, I believe the people will see them for what they are. Alexander left the meeting with renewed hope, but also with a clear understanding of the stakes. If Harrison's strategy failed, Alexander wouldn't just lose his succession rights. He'd be publicly discredited and effectively exiled from any meaningful role in governance. That evening, Alexander met with Isabel in her private sitting room to discuss their next moves. His sister had spent the day conducting her own investigation, and her findings were disturbing. Alex, I made some calls to contacts in London, Paris, and Vienna. Helena's network is much more extensive than we realized. Isabel consulted her notes. Morrison & Associates, the consulting firm she's working with, has offices in 12 countries. They specialize in what they call governmental transition management. What does that mean? It means they help orchestrate changes of leadership in unstable governments. Their client list includes 3 European monarchies that have undergone major constitutional reforms in the past decade. Alexander felt cold. Are you saying Helena's part of some kind of international effort to reshape monarchies? I'm saying Morrison & Associates has a very specific expertise, and it's not constitutional law in general. It's constitutional change management. They know how to destabilize existing leadership and install more compliant alternatives. Isabel pulled out a folder of documents she'd printed from her research. Look at this. Morrison & Associates helped arrange the transition in Valdonia when Prince Marcus was removed from succession after a corruption scandal. They also consulted on the constitutional crisis in Sylvania that resulted in dramatic restrictions on royal power. Alexander studied the documents with growing alarm. In both cases, the outcomes have been remarkably similar. Traditional monarchs or heirs have been replaced or constrained in favor of more business-friendly leadership that pursued aggressive economic development policies. Izzy, are you suggesting that Helena's part of some kind of international conspiracy? I'm suggesting that she's working with people whose business model is changing governments to favor corporate interests. Whether that's a conspiracy or just convergent interests, the result is the same. The implications were staggering. If Isabel was right, then Helena's efforts weren't just about personal ambition or even policy preferences. They were part of a broader pattern of monarchical manipulation designed to serve powerful economic interests. We need to share this information with Father, Alexander said. Isabel shook her head. Not yet. We need more proof, and we need to present it in a way that doesn't sound like a conspiracy theory. Right now, we have suspicions and circumstantial evidence. Helena can easily dismiss that as our desperate attempt to discredit her. Then what do you suggest? I suggest we set a trap. If Helena really is working with Morrison & Associates to orchestrate your removal and reshape the kingdom's policies, then she'll need to communicate with them about the succession review. If we can intercept those communications. Izzy, we can't spy on Helena. After what happened with the car search, any additional surveillance would destroy our credibility entirely. Isabel Smaid, we don't need to spy on her. We just need to make her think we have information that threatens her plans. If she's working with international consultants, she'll need to warn them about potential exposure. And desperate people make mistakes. The plan Isabel proposed was elegantly simple. Alexander would announce his intention to cooperate fully with the succession review, but he would also indicate that he planned to present evidence of foreign interference in the kingdom's internal affairs. He wouldn't specify what evidence he had or whom it implicated, but the announcement would force Helena to reassess her position and communicate with her allies about potential vulnerabilities. The key, Isabel explained, is to make the announcement in a way that suggests we know more than we're revealing. Helena will have to assume the worst and react accordingly. Alexander was impressed by his sister's strategic thinking, but he was also concerned about the risks. Izzy, if we're wrong about Helena's connections, this strategy could backfire spectacularly. And if we're right, but do nothing, she succeeds in removing you from succession and fundamentally altering our kingdom's future. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks. The next morning, Alexander held a press conference in the palace's main briefing room. The announcement had been scheduled with only a few hours' notice, ensuring that Helena couldn't prepare a coordinated response. I want to address the recent speculation about a formal review of the heir apparent's fitness for succession, Alexander began, looking directly into the cameras. I welcome this review as an opportunity to examine not just my own qualifications, but the various forces that seek to influence the kingdom's future direction. Alexander could see Helena enter the back of the briefing room, her expression carefully neutral but her posture tense. I believe the people of our kingdom deserve to know about any foreign consultants or advisors who may be influencing critical decisions about succession, environmental policy, and economic development. I intend to present evidence of such foreign involvement as part of the review process. The reaction in the room was immediate. Journalists began shouting questions, cameras flashed, and Alexander could see Helena's face go white before she turned and left the briefing room. I cannot provide specifics at this time, Alexander continued, but I can assure the people that any evidence of improper foreign influence will be presented in full during the review proceedings. The kingdom's sovereignty and the integrity of our constitutional processes must be protected. As Alexander left the podium, he noticed Sir Marcus Whitfield standing near the exit. The king's private secretary looked troubled, and he gestured for Alexander to follow him to a quiet alcove. Your Highness, that was a very serious accusation you just made. It was a promise to present evidence, not an accusation. Foreign influence in succession matters is effectively an accusation of treason. I hope you understand the implications. Alexander studied Marcus carefully. Sir Marcus, do you know something about foreign consultants advising the Queen Consort? The older man hesitated. I know that Her Majesty has been in regular communication with international advisors. I assume they were helping with economic policy development. What kind of regular communication? Daily calls, encrypted email correspondence, document sharing. The level of consultation has been extensive. Alexander's pulse quickened. Sir Marcus, would you be willing to testify about those communications if asked? Your Highness, that would put me in an impossible position between my duty to the crown and my loyalty to individual family members. What if those loyalties aligned? What if serving the crown meant revealing threats to its integrity? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. If His Majesty requested my testimony, I would provide it honestly and completely. As Alexander returned to his chambers, he found James waiting with an urgent message. King Edward requested his immediate presence in the private family quarters, not the formal study. The location suggested this would be a personal conversation rather than an official one. Alexander found his father in the small sitting room where the family had spent countless evenings when Alexander and Isabel were children. King Edward looked exhausted, and Alexander noticed his father's hands shaking slightly as he poured tea. Alexander, your press conference this morning has created quite a stir. I hoped it would. Helena is furious. She's demanding that I denounce your statements as irresponsible speculation designed to distract from your own fitness issues. Alexander sat across from his father. And what do you think? King Edward was quiet for several moments. I think my son doesn't make public statements about foreign influence unless he has good reason to believe such influence exists. But I also think that if such influence exists, It represents a threat to everything our family has worked to build. Father, what has Helena told you about her international consultants? She's mentioned economic advisors who help with policy development. She's never suggested they were involved in succession matters. Alexander chose his words carefully. What if I could prove that these advisors have been involved in succession planning in other countries? That their business model involves reshaping monarchical governments to serve corporate interests? King Edward's teacup rattled against its saucer. That would be deeply troubling. Would it be troubling enough to warrant investigation? It would be troubling enough to warrant immediate action. Alexander felt a surge of hope. His father was still capable of putting the kingdom's interests above personal considerations. But he also saw the pain in his father's eyes, the recognition that his second marriage might have been built on deception from the very beginning. Father, I need to ask you something difficult. When you met Helena, did she approach you? Or did you meet her through other contacts? King Edward frowned. She was introduced to me by Lord Pemberton at a charity function. Why do you ask? Lord Pemberton, who serves on the Cromwell Mining Consortium's board of directors? The color drained from King Edward's face. Alexander, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that perhaps your meeting with Helena wasn't as accidental as it appeared. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander watched his father process the implications of what he'd just heard. If Helena's introduction to the royal family had been orchestrated by corporate interests, then every subsequent development took on a sinister cast. King Edward stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Alexander, I need you to prepare a detailed presentation of everything you know or suspect about Helena's activities. I want documentation, evidence, witness statements, everything. Father, much of what I know comes from sources that Helena's lawyers will challenge. Then, we'll find sources they can't challenge. Sir Marcus will be instructed to provide full cooperation. The palace communications records will be reviewed, and, if necessary, we'll demand that Helena provide complete disclosure of her consulting arrangements. Alexander felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in days. And the succession review will proceed as scheduled, but it will examine all factors affecting the stability of the monarchy, not just your qualifications for leadership. As Alexander left the family quarters, he encountered Helena in the corridor. She looked furious, but also something else that Alexander hadn't seen before, genuinely worried. You've made a very serious mistake, she said quietly. Have I? You think you've been clever, but you have no idea what forces you're challenging. This goes far beyond palace politics, Alexander. Are you threatening me? Helena's laugh was bitter. I'm trying to warn you. You think this is about you and me, but it's about much larger interests. Interests that won't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens their objectives. Including my father? Helena's expression shifted to something almost like regret. Your father was never supposed to be in danger. This was about ensuring a smooth transition to leadership that could work with modern economic realities. Whose economic realities? Helena looked around nervously, as if worried about being overheard. Alexander, if you pursue this investigation, you'll discover things that will destroy not just me, but potentially your father and the monarchy itself. Are you prepared for that? I'm prepared to discover the truth, whatever that means. Helena stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head sadly. Truth is a luxury that monarchs can't always afford. I hope you remember that when you see what your investigation uncovers. As she walked away, Alexander realized that Helena's warning might be genuine. Whatever forces she was working with, they were apparently powerful enough to threaten even the monarchy itself. But Alexander also knew that backing down now would mean allowing those same forces to achieve their goals through deception and manipulation. The battle for the kingdom's future was about to begin in earnest, and Alexander was no longer certain that victory would be worth the price of winning. The formal succession review convened 1 week later in the palace's grand chamber, a room that hadn't hosted such momentous proceedings in over a century. Alexander sat at a polished mahogany table facing a panel of constitutional experts, senior judges, and Privy Council members, while Helena observed from the gallery alongside other interested parties. Lord Chancellor Harrison presided over the proceedings with the gravity befitting their historical significance. This review, he announced to the assembled dignitaries and press representatives, will examine all factors relevant to the stability and integrity of our monarchical succession. We are here not merely to evaluate the Crown Prince's fitness, but to ensure that our constitutional processes remain free from improper influence. The first day of testimony focused on Alexander's administrative record in the Northern Territories. Michael Reeves, the mining union leader, provided passionate testimony about environmental protections that had improved worker safety and community health. Sarah Pemberton, the union office coordinator, presented statistics showing decreased industrial accidents and improved air quality measures since Alexander's environmental initiatives had been implemented. The Crown Prince didn't just impose regulations from his palace office, Michael testified. He spent weeks in our communities, listening to our concerns, learning about our challenges. He understood that environmental protection and worker safety aren't luxuries for a thriving economy. They're necessities. Helena's legal team, led by Morrison and Associates partner Vincent Morrison himself, challenged every positive assessment. Morrison was a sharp-featured man in his 50s whose questions revealed an intimate knowledge of palace politics that made Alexander uneasy. Mr. Reeves, Morrison asked during cross-examination, isn't it true that the Crown Prince's environmental regulations have cost the Cromwell Mining Consortium millions in compliance expenses? Yes, and they've saved dozens of lives and prevented countless cases of respiratory illness. But you acknowledge that these costs have made Cromwell consider relocating their operations to other countries? I know they've threatened to relocate if they can't continue poisoning our air and water. Morrison's smile was cold. I see. And you believe the Crown Prince's policies are worth the potential loss of 30,000 jobs. Michael leaned forward. I believe the Crown Prince's policies prove that we can have both good jobs and clean air. Cromwell's threats are about maximizing profits, not protecting employment. The exchange continued for hours, with Morrison systematically attempting to portray Alexander's environmental stance as economically reckless idealism. But as the questioning proceeded, Alexander noticed something troubling. Morrison seemed to have access to internal palace communications and confidential economic projections that should have been restricted. During a recess, Alexander conferred with Lord Chancellor Harrison. How does Morrison know so much about our internal economic assessments? Harrison's expression was grim. That's an excellent question, one that suggests information sharing beyond what would be appropriate for this review. The second day brought more disturbing revelations. Dr. Pemberton, the kingdom's chief psychiatrist, was called to testify about the psychological evaluation that Helena had presented as evidence of Alexander's unfitness. Dr. Pemberton, Harrison began, please describe your professional relationship with Crown Prince Alexander. I have no professional relationship with His Royal Highness. I've never conducted any formal psychological evaluation of the Crown Prince. A murmur ran through the chamber. Helena's face remained impassive, but Alexander saw Vincent Morrison whisper urgently to one of his associates. Dr. Pemberton, are you familiar with this document? Harrison presented the fabricated evaluation that Alexander had photographed. Dr. Pemberton examined the papers carefully. This document bears my letterhead and what appears to be my signature, but I did not create this evaluation. The language used is not consistent with my professional terminology, and several of the assessment criteria referenced don't exist in standard psychological evaluation protocols. In your professional opinion, is this document authentic? No, Lord Chancellor. This document is a fabrication. The revelation sent shockwaves through the chamber. Helena stood abruptly and left the gallery, while Morrison requested an immediate recess to confer with his clients. But the most explosive testimony came on the third day, when Sir Marcus Whitfield was called to discuss palace communications. Under Harrison's careful questioning, Marcus revealed the extensive foreign consultation that had been conducted without King Edward's knowledge. Sir Marcus, Please describe the communications you've observed between Queen Consort Helena and international advisors. Marcus consulted his notes with obvious reluctance. Her Majesty has been in daily contact with Morrison and Associates for approximately 18 months. These communications have included detailed discussions of succession planning, constitutional law, and economic policy development. Were these communications authorized by His Majesty? No, Lord Chancellor. His Majesty was informed that Her Majesty was consulting with economic advisors, but the scope and frequency of these consultations was not disclosed. What specific topics were discussed in these consultations? Marcus took a deep breath. Strategies for modifying environmental regulations, plans for restructuring royal duties and responsibilities, assessments of the Crown Prince's political vulnerabilities, and what were described as transition management scenarios. Transition management scenarios? Discussions of how to manage changes in succession under various circumstances, including the Crown Prince's removal from the line of succession. The chamber erupted in shocked whispers. Vincent Morrison was on his feet immediately. Lord Chancellor, this testimony represents hearsay and speculation about confidential communications that Sir Marcus may have misunderstood. Harrison's voice cut through the commotion. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that Sir Marcus has fabricated his testimony? I'm suggesting that a private secretary may not be qualified to interpret complex constitutional discussions. It was then that Alexander realized the full scope of what they were dealing with. Morrison wasn't just Helena's lawyer. He was the architect of the entire campaign against Alexander's succession. The man's intimate knowledge of palace operations and his immediate defensive responses revealed someone who had been deeply involved in planning rather than simply providing legal representation. Mr. Morrison, Harrison said carefully, your firm specializes in what you call governmental transition management. Could you explain what that means? Morrison's composure slipped slightly. We provide constitutional and legal consulting services to governments facing leadership transitions. And how many such transitions have you helped facilitate? Lord Chancellor, I fail to see how our firm's client history is relevant to these proceedings. I think it's very relevant, especially given the testimony we've heard about extensive consultations regarding succession planning that occurred without His Majesty's authorization. Alexander watched Vincent Morrison weigh his options. The lawyer could continue to deflect, but Harrison's questions were clearly leading somewhere specific, where he could acknowledge Morrison and Associates' track record and risk exposing the broader pattern of their activities. Our firm has provided consultation services during constitutional transitions in several European nations, Morrison admitted finally, including transitions that resulted in changes of succession. Including transitions that resulted in various constitutional modifications. Yes. Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Morrison, did your firm recommend the creation of fabricated psychological evaluations in those other transitions? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Morrison's face went pale as he realized the trap he'd walked into. If he denied recommending fabricated documents, he implicitly acknowledged that Helena had acted beyond his firm's guidance. If he admitted to recommending such tactics, he confessed to a pattern of fraudulent activity. Lord Chancellor, I must object to these questions as beyond the scope of this review. On the contrary, Mr. Morrison, understanding whether the evidence presented in this review follows patterns established in other countries is entirely relevant to evaluating its authenticity and reliability. It was at that moment that Helena returned to the chamber, accompanied by two people Alexander didn't recognize. One was a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and cold blue eyes. The other was a man who looked like corporate security, all sharp suit and watchful demeanor. The woman approached Morrison and whispered something that made his face go even paler. Helena took her seat with an expression of grim determination that made Alexander's stomach clench with apprehension. Lord Chancellor, Helena stood to address the panel. I request permission to present additional evidence that I believe will clarify the true nature of these proceedings. Harrison looked surprised, but nodded. The panel will hear your evidence, Your Majesty." Helena gestured to the silver-haired woman. "This is Margaret Sinclair, senior partner at Morrison & Associates London office. Ms. Sinclair has information about the Crown Prince's own foreign connections that I believe this panel must consider." Alexander felt ice form in his veins. Whatever Helena was about to present, it had been prepared as a backup plan for exactly this situation. Margaret Sinclair approached the witness table with the confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "Lord Chancellor, distinguished panel members, I have evidence that Crown Prince Alexander has been in unauthorized communication with foreign environmental groups that seek to undermine the kingdom's economic sovereignty." "What evidence?" Harrison asked sharply. Sinclair produced a folder of documents. Correspondence between the Crown Prince and the European Environmental Alliance, a consortium of environmental groups funded by foreign governments that oppose resource extraction industries. These communications discuss strategies for preventing mining operations and industrial development across multiple countries. Alexander's mind raced. He had indeed corresponded with environmental groups during his work on the Northern Territories, but those have been legitimate consultations about best practices and scientific research. If Sinclair was characterizing them as some kind of foreign conspiracy, it meant Helena had been monitoring his communications for months. Furthermore, Sinclair continued, "We have evidence that the Crown Prince has received funding from these foreign environmental groups to support his policy initiatives." "That's completely false," Alexander said, rising from his seat. "Your Highness," Harrison said firmly, "you'll have an opportunity to respond to these allegations." Sinclair smiled thinly. The European Environmental Alliance provided the Crown Prince with research funding, expert consultants, and policy recommendations that directly informed his environmental regulations. This foreign influence was never disclosed to His Majesty or to the appropriate governmental authorities. As Sinclair presented her evidence, Alexander realized the diabolical cleverness of Helena's trap. The environmental consultations that Alexander had pursued as part of his official duties were being reframed as secret foreign influence. The research funding had been legitimate grants to the kingdom's environmental ministry, not personal payments to Alexander, but Sinclair was deliberately obscuring that distinction. The irony, Sinclair concluded, is that while questioning Queen Consort Helena's consultation with legal experts, which is entirely appropriate for someone in her position, Crown Prince Alexander has been secretly collaborating with foreign groups whose agenda directly contradicts the kingdom's economic interests. Helena stood again. "Lord Chancellor, these revelations demonstrate that this review has been initiated not to protect the kingdom's sovereignty, but to distract from the Crown Prince's own compromising foreign entanglements. The fabricated psychological evaluation, which I deeply regret, was created in response to intelligence about these foreign connections. While I cannot excuse the methods used, I believe the panel must consider the threats that prompted such desperate measures." Alexander saw the brilliance of Helena's strategy. By acknowledging the fabricated evaluation while simultaneously presenting evidence of his own supposed foreign connections, she was positioning herself as the flawed but patriotic defender of the kingdom against his treasonous environmental agenda. The problem was that Helena's evidence, while misleading, wasn't entirely fabricated. Alexander had corresponded with international environmental groups. The kingdom had received research funding from European environmental organizations. If those facts were presented without proper context, they could indeed appear suspicious to panel members who didn't understand the legitimate nature of international environmental cooperation. "Lord Chancellor," Alexander requested permission to address the panel. "I respectfully request the opportunity to respond to these allegations immediately." Harrison nodded. "The panel will hear your response, Your Highness." Alexander stood, knowing that his next words would determine not just his own future, but possibly the fate of the kingdom itself. Helena had turned his environmental advocacy into evidence of treason, and he needed to expose the lie while maintaining his credibility. "Distinguished panel members," Alexander began, "what Ms. Sinclair has presented is a carefully crafted distortion of legitimate environmental policy work. Every consultation with international environmental groups, was conducted through official channels and reported to the appropriate ministries. The research funding she references was provided to the kingdom's Department of Natural Resources, not to me personally, and was used to develop scientifically sound environmental policies. Alexander pulled out his own folder of documents. I have here the official correspondence that authorizes these international consultations, the ministry reports documenting the use of research funding, and the environmental impact studies that resulted from this collaboration. All of this work was conducted transparently and in service of the kingdom's long-term interests. He turned to face Helena directly. What the panel should ask is why Queen Consort Helena was monitoring my official communications, why she was collaborating with foreign consultants without disclosure, and why she fabricated evidence to undermine legitimate environmental policy work that enjoys broad public support. Margaret Sinclair interjected, "Your Highness, the European Environmental Alliance has explicit political objectives that include the elimination of resource extraction industries. Your collaboration with such groups represents a direct conflict with the kingdom's economic interests." Alexander smiled grimly. "Ms. Sinclair, the European Environmental Alliance includes governmental agencies from 12 countries, including several of our closest allies. Are you suggesting that environmental cooperation with our allies constitutes treason?" The question caught Sinclair off guard, and Alexander pressed his advantage. Furthermore, the elimination of resource extraction industries isn't the alliance's objective. Their objective is the development of sustainable extraction practices that protect environmental and public health. Unless, of course, you believe that clean air and water are incompatible with economic development. Lord Chancellor Harrison leaned forward. "Ms. Sinclair, does your firm's client, the Cromwell Mining Consortium, have a financial interest in preventing international environmental cooperation?" Another telling question that forced Sinclair to reveal the corporate interests behind Helena's opposition to Alexander's policies. "Lord Chancellor, Cromwell Mining is one of many clients whose legitimate business interests are threatened by radical environmental policies. So your evidence against the Crown Prince comes from a company that profits directly from the environmental policies he opposes?" Alexander watched Sinclair realize that Harrison had expertly maneuvered her into exposing